experience with Dr. Hall and Dr. Clifton?
Mm-hmm. Well, actually, I took a class from Bill Hall, and he talked a lot about the things they were doing. And as I recall, one of the first things he talked about was the fact that in the insurance industry, about 90% of the new insurance salesmen don't last more than about a year. And so the industry is very concerned about the cost of hiring and training new people repeatedly. And so he told a little bit about the fact that he and Don Clifton were trying to devise some type of questionnaire that high-performing insurance salesmen answered differently than those who didn't make it. And so essentially what they were doing was they were studying the best, the high producers, and at that time in psychology, most people were either studying abnormal psychology, people who had psychoses, many depressive illness, those kinds of problems, or else they were studying rats, trying to figure out why rats would hit a bar so many times for a pellet of food, or what made them turn right or left in a maze, with the idea that if they could understand rats, then maybe they could move on to chimpanzees or monkeys, and then maybe someday they would be able to understand and predict what human beings would do. And so that was kind of where psychology was, and nobody was really involved in studying high-performing individuals, and so they were really kind of groundbreaking individuals at that time.
So was Dr. Hall or Dr. Clifton one of your dissertation advisors?
No, a guy named Bob Stake. He was a statistician, and he was more involved with why rats turned which way in a maze. And then for the doctor's degree, it was Warren Ballard was the chairman of the department. Now, Hall and Clifton were in some ways seen as a little bit different because of their orientation. They were not considered to be hardcore researchers. They were not within the mainstream of psychology at that point. But they obviously did some great things, and I knew what they were, the kinds of things that they were doing with their project. And then later on, when Don Clifton founded what is now Gallup, it was at that time SRI, Selection Research, and of course what they were doing, they were specializing in trying to differentiate high performers from those who wouldn't do as well. And so various companies were buying their questionnaires and their surveys, and they were trying to do lots of interviews with high-performing people to find out what made them unique. So they asked me to join SRI in an advisory board capacity. And so I remember the meeting we had one time when they were debating back and forth whether to purchase the name Gallup. Gallup at that time was strictly a polling company, and I remember the price tag was $10 million for that name. The Gallup brothers were deciding that they were going to try to sell the name, and so people went back and forth, and finally the decision was made to go ahead and buy the name Gallup, and of course that turned out to be a very good investment. But at the time that it was done, SRI was kind of on the brink financially, and I think it was a pretty big hurdle for them. So it was a much bigger decision than what many people would think that it might have been at that time. And of course now they've moved on into other areas where they're doing a lot of political polling and those kinds of things, as well as some of the selection research that they did a long time ago. So anyway, and Don Clifton lived across the park from me, so we got to be reasonably good friends, and I think we admired each other. At least I admired him. I don't know if he admired me. And so anyway, that was kind of where our relationship began.
Well, how have their ideas impacted your work as a coach, as a dad, as athletic director, as a congressman?
Well, many people have read the book by Don Clifton and Tom Rath called "How Full Is Your Bucket?" And in that book, Don pretty much traces the idea of positive psychology, the fact that so many prisoners of war in the Korean War died. I think it was about 38% died, and they were not beaten, they were not tortured, they were not malnourished, but they were divided away from leaders. They were encouraged to inform on each other. They got any kind of bad news that came from home, no good news, nothing supportive. And he said, you know, if negative news and negative environment could create that kind of chaos, then maybe the opposite would be true, that positive reinforcement, a kind word, might have a symbiotic effect on people. And so that was sort of, I guess, the genesis of the idea of positive psychology. And I guess as far as coaching is concerned, I came to believe that the best way to change behavior was to, if you could, catch somebody doing something right and reinforce it. Sometimes people see coaching as continually criticizing and fault-finding and chewing people out, but that gets pretty old, and it really doesn't do a whole lot to promote better behavior. And so I remember Lou Holtz coming up to visit us. He was coaching at Arkansas at the time. It was during the season. He had an open date, and I'd never had a coach ever ask me to come up and watch our practices and sit in our meetings during the season. He was the only one that ever did. And so he was there for about 2 days, and before he left, he said, the one thing that really jumped out at me about this place was how positive your coaches were. He said he'd never seen anything like that before. I said, well, I'm glad you saw that, because I guess that's the way I would want it to be. And so it didn't mean that there was never an unkind word, you know, in coaching. But for the most part, we did try to be positive. And if we caught somebody doing something wrong, we wanted to make sure that they understood how to do it right. Mm-hmm. So often people just criticize, and they really never explain very clearly what it is they want. And you know, there are ways to correct improper behavior in a positive way. Mm-hmm. And so that's what we tried to do, and I think that made a difference. And in the athletic department, I try to create a culture or an environment that's fairly positive. I think the research from the Department of Labor indicates that that most people leave their jobs do so not because of benefits or pay, but because they don't feel appreciated. Mm-hmm. And so something like 65% of people report that they've not received a compliment or a kind word about their work in the past year. And so probably one of the most cost-effective and most effective things that a person can do with employees or others that they're around is to point out the good things and to recognize the things that are positive that people do.
Well, as you know, Dr. Hall and Dr. Clifton established Nebraska Human Resources
Mm-hmm.
Research Foundation
right
about 1949, and they built the foundation on the idea of the investment relationship to mm-hmm. help people recognize their talents and invest in those talents. And I think one of your most famous examples of the investment relationship is through your coaching. So how mm-hmm. did you take this idea of the investment relationship, and how did you create those kinds of relationships mm-hmm. with your players?
Well, I've already mentioned how you would correct a player. You know, if a player tackles with his head down, you could say, you know, Jones, you idiot, you tackled with your head down again, and you could be hurt badly, and I hope you are. You deserve it. Or you could say, you know, Jones, we've seen you do it right 1,000 times. Keep your head up, lock your arms, drive your feet, and we know you can do that. And that's a way to tackle. And so there's a difference in how you correct people. So we think that was important. I thought that building relationships with players was important. And so every day we would lift weights after practice, and I'd go in there and I'd mess around in the weight room. Obviously, you can see from looking at me, it didn't take very well. But I'd be down there for 20, 30 minutes, and in the course of that time, I would usually talk to maybe 5 or 6 players for 3, 4, 5 minutes, and usually it would be about their grades or about their high school team or their family, and it would be pretty much strictly on their turf, on their terms. And so one thing that they reported later in a book that was written was that we knew their names, and we not only knew their names, but we knew the names usually of their parents and quite often their brothers and sisters, and that we treated the players on the first team just as we would the players on the fourth team, and that they were convinced as players that they were important to us as people. You know, the first team player was going to be more important to you on Saturday afternoon because he was going to play, but they felt that the well-being, the academic progress, the health of all the players was equally important to us. And so I think that was something that helped build the culture, and I think that we usually had pretty good team chemistry, and I think that was part of it.
Well, I have to tell you, when I teach the NHRA class to our incoming sophomores every year, we talk about referent power, power by virtue of respect. And I always use you as the perfect example of that. And that many of your former players talk about how they'd run through a wall for you if you asked them. And I think a lot about your walk-on program. You know, here are these guys who had decent talent, but they weren't being recruited for scholarship positions. And you were able to find that talent and develop it to where they were producing at a maximum level. Did you have a philosophy behind that?
Well, well, you know, football is pretty much of a developmental sport. It may not be quite like basketball or golf, where sometimes by the time a person's a senior in high school, their skills are pretty fully developed. And so we have people in the state with fairly big frames, and so you might find a guy that was 6'5" and 215 and fairly big bones, and with a good weight program and some encouragement, wouldn't be right away, but within 3 years, you know, that guy might be 280 pounds and improve his speed and his strength. And so the developmental aspects of football helped us as far as the walk-ons were concerned. But also, I think a very important part of it was the fact that we tried to structure practice, and we tried to build the program in such a way that they all felt that they were treated equally. Most of the walk-ons could not really tell you who the scholarship players were or who the walk-ons were. And most scholarship players couldn't tell you whether most players were walk-ons or scholarship. They were treated exactly the same, and I think that made a difference. And whether you played or not on Saturday didn't really make any difference whether you were a scholarship player. And if you were able to grade better than somebody else at your position, you moved ahead of them. And we tried to save a number of scholarships every year for walk-ons. The standard deal was that if a player became either first or second at his position at the end of spring ball, then we would reward them with a scholarship. And so they always knew that that carrot, that opportunity was out there. And so as we looked at it over the years, you know, our travel squad was usually about 60 players. And I think I've averaged it out one time over a 5 or 6 year period that we probably traveled about 24 walk-ons, guys who came as walk-ons. About 24 out of the 60 on average were players who came as walk-ons. So when you figure that about 40% of your players who were really contributing and playing an important role on Saturday afternoon came as walk-ons, that was a tremendous boost to our team. And of those, you'd usually have 5, 6, 7, maybe sometimes as many as 8 or 9 who were actually starting among the top 22, 24 players.
Well, is there anything else with regard to your experience with Dr. Hall and Dr. Clifton, or this idea of positive psychology, that has had an impact on your work that we haven't discussed already?
Well, not much, other than the fact that they took something that was theoretical, and particularly in Don Clifton's case, they moved far beyond that. And went out in the business world and began to apply some of the things that they thought made sense, and began to substantiate it with research. And of course, everyone can see what has happened with Gallup and the old SRI principles. And you got guys like Marcus Buckingham and others who have gone on to become very prominent in the field, Jim Clifton, and Jane Miller and others, and so they've certainly gone beyond the halls of academia. And so often that's kind of where it ends. Somebody has a theory or writes a book, but they never really apply it. These guys did, and they proved that there was something there, and it's now widely accepted. And yet back in those days of the early 1960s, there were a lot of people who were in the discipline of psychology who would have no part of it. And so time has really proven that they were on the right track.
Mm-hmm. Tom, I do want to tell you that when I talk to these kids about building investment relationships, and they're all working one-on-one with a K-12 student, I often reference your relationship with your players and your former
That's
players.
good.
Just talk about what the difference you made with
You
them.
just-
So for what that's worth.
Just as long as you pick the right players, it'll work.